Let's begin. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we'll be discussing a very important topic of mental health care, resources, and the needs of people of different generations with special guests, Christina Miller, President and CEO of Mental Health America of Los Angeles, and Susan Gurley, Executive Director of Anxiety and Depression Association of America, which is located in Maryland. A reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show. We'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you for joining us. It's just great to see you. And I just want to set this up. I'm going to go to you, Christina. If you look at the need for emotional support in this country, we have a history of ignoring such needs, dismissing the need that we all have periodically as a weakness. We can accentuate that need through codependence, or we can deal with these needs that we all have as a legitimate part of our humanity. So I'd like to go to you, Christina, and just talk a little bit about how we should be thinking about mental health, how we should all be thinking about mental health, particularly in this time when we're undergoing really severe stresses through this COVID experience and through the disasters that are hitting our country.
Yeah, thank you. For a long time, not just in our country, but around the world, we tended to think, and this is still prevalent, think of mental health as a binary process, where you're either normal or you're mentally ill. And that's has a lot to do with the huge stigma that's been attached to mental health and mental illness. And we use the word mental illness, which I personally have trouble with. But one of the good things that has come out of the pandemic, and there are very few good things, but one of them is that there's an understanding, a greater understanding that we all have some level of mental health, and it fluctuates and it changes based on the supports we have, based on the amount of stress we're under, based on the trauma we're going through. And so there's more of an openness right now to discussing it, to reevaluating it, to look at where people are in terms of how they're doing. I don't think there's anybody out there who would say right now with this pandemic, oh, my mental health is just great. Maybe your mental health is great in light of all the stress that we're under. But lots of people are suffering, but they suffer in different ways, and everybody copes in different ways. So I think we're learning to think of mental health as this broad spectrum of coping skills and resources and supports and ways of managing our internal states and our communication. It's a very big thing. With physical health, there's a tendency to think you try to be as healthy as you can, even though you may have allergies or diabetes or some condition. It doesn't make you sick in a very broad way. And we need to think of mental health more in that way. We want to look at how we can optimize our well-being.
I think it's such a good point. You know, we seem to be discovering more and more that there are interactions between these various biological systems and our environment, right? You can have medicine interactions where you're taking a medication for one condition. I took a combination of prescribed pain deadeners and then muscle relaxants that sent me into a psychological tailspin. It just completely surprised me. I got off of that instantaneously. I had never experienced anything like that before. On the other hand, we're learning more about the interaction of diet, of our other, of what's happening in our gut in terms of affecting our attitudes. When you look at this, at building a team, and one of the things that I think is interesting, Susan, you as an attorney, you're running an organization, you're ensuring that the organization is sound, and you're also building a team. When you're looking at building a team, how do you determine what kind of specialties you're going to include within your programmatic group to ensure that you're serving your clients really well?
So first of all, thank you for having me. You ask a very interesting question for nonprofit leaders. In the past, I think most of the hiring was done regarding whether you believed in the mission. So rather than looking at whether you also had the skill sets to be a part of an organization. So when I hire people in any of my positions, I of course want people to believe in the cause that we're working on. But I also want to make sure that you are, a communications expert, you are a project manager, you are a lawyer, you're a compliance officer. Because as a nonprofit leader, we have to ensure that the organization is led well. We have to ensure that we can fulfill our mission. And it is not enough to hire only people who believe in the mission. We have a duty to the mission, we have a duty to our donors, and we have a duty as leaders of nonprofits to lead the organization as well or even better than a for-profit organization. So I'm not sure that all nonprofit leaders would share my opinion, but I think it's very important to have the right skill sets. And in our organization, and I think Christina would agree, we want people who are very understanding and empathetic to people who are suffering. And I agree with you, I don't like the word mental illness, and who feel comfortable having the conversations. And that goes to Christina's point. We've gotten better about talking about it, but people are still frightened. And you go to a dinner party and somebody says they're not feeling depressed. And I've noticed people try to change the conversation very quickly because they don't know what follow-up question to ask.
Right. And they don't want to become too confessional because of the the stigma that attaches within your social group, within your peers. It might affect your employment. How do you deal with that, Christina? How do you destigmatize? Because it seems that we have to not only treat the patient, but we have a larger problem with treating the society, because out of the attitudes of society comes a part of our mental health challenge, right? I mean, if I break an arm, nobody's going to say, "Oh, Mark, he's a weak person and it could affect his job performance." No, I put it in a cast and I continue doing the work that I'm doing. But we have this situation where somehow those needs, which are routine, there's a fear about the other's attitudes that we don't have with other physical issues. In your organization, are you functioning also as an advocacy advocacy group for social change in terms of our attitudes?
Yeah, we're a 100-year-old organization, and we have a long history of advocating for rights around mental health. But to your point of the stigma, I think that this is a prime time for that change to occur, and it actually is occurring. One of the things that our agency does, one of the most important things we do, is that we bring in all the components that feed into well-being. We don't just provide therapy. We provide healthcare. We have 20 nurses on our team. We have employment programs. We have special programs for veterans. We have programs that help you with education, with whatever part of your life isn't going well that can affect your mental well-being. We want to address that, because mental health there's this idea that, especially from the past, that if you want to improve your mental health, you go to a therapist, you sit in a room for a little less than an hour and you talk about your past.
And you pay a lot of money, and there's this whole thing, you're going to be on a couch, and it's going to be one thing, but you're saying it's not one thing.
It's not one thing, and I think that one approach doesn't address the range of mental health issues that everyone is dealing with. Like, we reach youth by having different activities. A lot of what people are missing is connections with other people. You want to provide them with all kinds of different ways in which they can begin to feel better. And talking to someone inside of I'm not saying, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. So I spent a lot of years doing therapy for people, with people. it's very helpful, but it puts mental health in a kind of mystique category where it becomes, well, that's just something that a therapist can deal with. No one else can. I think it's really key that we begin, our agency does a lot of this. We want to educate the public about how they have control over their mental well-being, to give them the skills to do that. This isn't a set of knowledge points where only certain people should have access to it. You want the whole field of mental health to be accessible to the public. And that's why we have a very strong education component.
I think this is really an important point. And I love the fact that you, Christina, have a clinical background, and you, Susan, come from the law, right? So more of an administrative point, but you found yourselves both running organizations from your different backgrounds. And that point that you just made, Christina, is so important. It is not true that in order to provide mental health services, even being on the front lines, is all about the university degree that you happen to possess, right? It is also about the lived experience that you bring to the table. It's also about the techniques that you might learn, perhaps not through university, but through interactions with people. So could you talk a little bit, Christina, about how you came to this administrative role and how you shape your teams? Susan was talking primarily about the whole idea of requiring best-in-class skills for each of the different functions that are required by these organizations. When you build your teams, how do you look at the qualifications that people bring to the table, and particularly your frontline service providers? Do you select people based on the cohorts that you serve and the issues that they face, or do you select them based on their educational pedigree, their treatment, or is it a combination? How does that work?
It's a great question, Mark. We have interdisciplinary teams. And by that, I don't just mean that we have people with certain specialties. Some of the people we hire are straight out of college, or maybe they never went to college, but they're very interested in this area. They're willing to get training. What we do is we view the team that serves each of the different departments we have as bringing a whole set of skills to what a particular person or a group needs. And that includes housing, employment, financial health, mental health, medical care. So we want people with expertise in those different areas, but we also
does it include lived experience? So,
yes.
For example, growing up in poverty, or issues of race or gender or orientation, does it include those kinds of factors as well?
We're one of the most diverse agencies in LA County, not just in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of a person's background. We hire, I would say 25 to 30% of our staff have lived experience of one form or another. Many of them, and we have people who were homeless in the past because of things that they went through, or they've had a mental health issue and they've worked to overcome it, or they're still working to overcome it on an ongoing basis. Those individuals are really key in terms of working with the people we serve, in terms of the empathy they bring, in terms of their experience. So we're very much a melting pot in terms of who we hire and what they bring to the whole process. I mean, that's something we're really proud of. It's an important part of our program.
And I feel so much that we're all involved in the mental health journey, right? We all suffer from anxiety. We all suffer from depression. We might not process it. We might not label it in that way. But, and a certain amount of anxiety is good, I guess, right? It sort of incites and it creates focus and so on. Susan, as you shape your responses to your communities, could you just describe how you look at the different types of experiences that you're trying to address? We just asked a question. We said, it relates to age and mental health. All of the factors being equal, what time of life do you feel people suffer the greatest mental health challenge? And 58% of those responding said it's adolescence is the real era of challenge. But we also got quite a few people who said age really isn't a factor, that we all kind of suffer from challenges at different ages. So how do you look at the cohorts that you serve, and how do you create your staff so that they are well positioned to serve those different cohorts of clients?
Well, before I answer that question, I wanted to really agree with Christina. And I think because I run a professional membership organization, and I think a lot of clinicians would agree with you, Christina, that there's a lot of complementary things that have to go along with sitting on a couch. And I think especially the younger clinicians understand that sitting in an antiseptic room and just talking to someone may not be enough. So I do think the mental health profession is becoming more open to an array of tools that are available. So I think things are changing.
That is such an important point. The whole idea that the profession itself
is changing
and really looking at it from a client need point of view. I think that's such an important point, because we can get into our little ivory tower and then end up cycling through repetitive models that just don't work unless we listen to the people who have the need, right?
And I think I have noticed this with our membership, is this pandemic, especially having to be virtual. A lot of things were new, not just for the patients, but for the therapists. And I think it really made everyone have to evaluate how they are providing therapy. And I think it's also been interesting to see how, going back to the peer-to-peer, if you look at some of the developing world that does not have, like there's certain countries that barely have clinicians and psychiatrists.
Right.
So a lot of the donor funding and USAID have been focused on how to do peer-to-peer, lay-to-lay person therapy, where you can talk to somebody, you can train people to be open and having conversations. So I think there are so many different models available in the therapeutic field. And I think everybody realizes that we have to innovate. We cannot use the same models that we did 100 years ago, sitting or lying on the couch. That doesn't work anymore, nor does America want to spend that much money on mental health care, and we have to change that. But going back to your question, is we're not a direct services organization, so my staff or our team does not provide direct services to the public. Our professionals, our members provide services to the public. And I'd also like to mention, which we didn't talk about, is the whole idea of also how medication plays into therapy. And that goes to Christina's point and your point, having agency over knowledge, that the average person does not know different therapeutic models. What does CBT mean? What does this mean? We don't even know some of the things that we're going to be receiving or what the medications do. So I think both Christina's and my organization are trying very hard to educate people to ask the right questions so that we are informed. So we know what the therapy, like I don't know what model you did, Christina, when you did therapy, but I think most people don't understand the therapeutic.
Yeah, there was that whole thing, Christina, about doctors being the experts and the patients just sort of having to accept what the doctors say. Isn't it now more of a collaboration where people are looking at themselves and using the doctor as kind of a consultant more, and we're trying to shift that whole psychology surrounding, a very hierarchical psychology surrounding medical treatment into a more equitable one?
I think that's right, but it goes even further than that. Our agency doesn't even someone may not even need therapy or may not even respond to what you and I would call therapy. What they need is to talk to someone who can steer them to the things that are causing them problems, who can connect them with people, who can provide support. And so we provide what we call mental health services. Not everyone is open to any sort of traditional therapy. And so it's extremely broad in terms of what you want to bring to someone. We say that we want to meet them where they are and figure out what the individual needs, and then in a collaboration with them, figure out what we can provide them and where they want to go. And that's really, really key. And that may include some form of traditional therapy, it may not. A lot of people who are suffering right now, they're suffering because of what they've been through. And they need us to help them deal with the trauma, and maybe they lost their job. That's going to bring anyone down. We need to help them regain and gain, for the first time in some cases, those things that they've identified that they need.
Yeah, so maybe it's taking a break. Maybe it's getting exercise. Maybe it's socializing. Maybe it's having a little bit of quiet time. So it's not necessarily the traditional type of approaches. When you start to look at the person and from the person's need out, and you, as a medical professional, add your expertise to the person's expertise on themselves, you can actually shape an approach that might not be included in the normal definition of a medical treatment, but could be extraordinarily effective.
That's right. That's right.
We just completed another poll, really interesting poll. We said, we asked about barriers to treatment. This was really interesting. We said, have any of the following ever stopped you from seeking mental health services? And we included a whole range of things, including nothing has ever stopped me from seeking treatment. 20% said that nothing had ever stopped them. But what was really interesting is that there are so many different barriers that people identified. And it's pretty evenly divided. Didn't know where to find resources, don't know what to expect, can't afford the cost or the time. I don't want to worry family, I don't want to worry other people, so I don't want to get treatment because I don't want to worry somebody else. There's stigma, which is a big part of this. Full 36% said stigma, and there are other impediments. How do we change that fact that 20% of the people just get what they need? And if I have a cold, I'm going to go to a place, get some aspirin and so on, and I'm going to deal with it. Whereas if I have a mental health issue, if I'm part of the 80%, I've got barriers. How do we change that?
So I'll jump in real quickly because it's been an ongoing issue, because we hear this from people. During the pandemic, I'll just use that time frame. Therapists were overwhelmed. So let's go into the traditional model that you want to see a therapist. Therapists didn't have enough room in their schedule. So if you think about just that, if you wanted to see a therapist, you could not have access to a therapist. Let's say you had enough money and you knew which therapist to call. There are also parts of the country where there are not enough therapists. So you may have the money, you may have the interest, but there's not enough people near you, putting aside that you can now do it virtually. But our therapists also became overwhelmed. They're people too. So they themselves were overwhelmed with the pandemic. So their bandwidth came down. So it's been a very interesting confluence of events that again goes to the fact that we may have to have different modalities moving forward. Because if our mental health professionals are overwhelmed, don't have enough time in their schedules, where are people supposed to go to? So I think this is a real wake-up call to all of us and to the medical establishment that we need to think about this, as Christina said, and you've mentioned, very, very differently. We need more stakeholders who can help people.
Christina, did you find yourselves overwhelmed by the demand?
I wouldn't say we were overwhelmed. Our agency grew during the pandemic. Our budget has grown. It was, we were very lucky. I have a wonderful staff, and we were able to pivot to provide some of our services remotely. But we also expanded services because new things were needed. But I want to address one point that I think is really key connected to this. I feel incredibly optimistic right now about what's going on in the mental health field. My colleagues across the country are pushing in many different ways to really bring about things that we've needed. There's a push to get emergency response lines to anyone who's in a crisis so that they can pick up the phone and call someone. We have it here in LA County, where we have a large homelessness problem. There was an increase in services made available during the pandemic for people who were homeless to get them medical care, to get them off the streets. So there were more resources flowing into it. And people fall in anywhere along the continuum in terms of the level of care they need and what their needs are. But there's been a real effort to provide different modalities of reaching them. Our agency is doing a lot right now in the area of education, and we're working on developing eventually an app that people can connect to, even if it's 2 a.m. and they're having a problem. So having remote services may not be as good as in person, but it's valuable, and then someone can get linked further down the line to more of an in-person connection. Or maybe they don't even need that. Maybe what they need is just to talk to someone on the phone.
It's such an interesting point. We're doing a lot of work in the mental health area, and one of the things that we're finding is that agencies are divided into those that are ready to go toward inclusion of these more modern approaches that leverage expertise, very often tech-enabled through mobile and so on and so forth. It creates its own set of challenges for both the organizations and for people out there who need to have access to broadband and that kind of thing. Are you finding, and we're coming to the end of our time, are you finding that your members are adjusting, Susan, to this kind of a shift that includes different, more innovative models of providing services in ways that leverage capability, no matter without a thought about geography? Are you finding your members are doing that? And then Christina, if you could also jump in and answer the same question.
So I definitely think our members are becoming much more open to use technology in how they deal with their clients. I think one of the things, it's again a bit of an age group. I think as an older person, it takes me a while to learn technology. I think our younger members feel very comfortable implementing technology in their therapeutic models. I think one of the things that organizations like us can do, and we're trying, is to provide training so that our clinicians don't have barriers to using the tools, and also giving information about the array of tools that are available. And as Christina said, there's tremendous out there. I mean, the virtual reality, the apps, I mean, the sky is the limit when it comes to technology. We just as consumers and as therapists and researchers have to feel comfortable to use it.
So you have to learn how to leverage it. And Christina, how are you approaching this?
Well, one thing I want to point out, which I think is really important, is there's a real digital divide between those who have dealt a lot with technology and have the resources to use that as a mechanism. If you've got, suppose you have a family that has a lot of people crowded into a space, they're going to have trouble just finding a quiet room to talk to someone, whether it's on the phone or their computer. A lot of kids may not feel comfortable. You need the personal connection. Everybody's different. So I think that it helps us reach people. One of the things we've worked on during the pandemic is getting computers for people who didn't have them, getting them internet access, helping them learn how to look for a job on the internet during the pandemic, giving people the resources and skills who didn't have those so that they can function better. Otherwise, we're going to end up with part of our society that can really benefit with the technology and others who are left behind. So that's something we're really aware of and focused on.
You're making such an important point. We could talk about this for another hour. We just completed a poll, and I'm going to close with this and give Susan the last word. The poll is what would help people connect with needed mental health resources. You're pointing out something that's really important, which is that in order to ameliorate mental health problems, you sometimes have to go above and beyond what would normally define as a mental health organization's role, this whole idea of providing computers, because without a computer, there might be a barrier to connecting online to treatment. I think that's a really, really important point. There is an infrastructure issue that we have and an availability issue that we have that is getting in the way of us healing. Some of the other answers that we also found were really issues of normalizing the discussion around mental health and making it equivalent to physical health for us all. I thought it was a great point, but the number one answer was funding, because these organizations do require a certain amount of support. So Susan, just to close this off, when you look at the issue of expertise, and then also the funding that's required and the infrastructure that's required to deliver that, how do you see the field developing in a way so that the infrastructure is sufficiently robust to provide a strong platform for the service? And I'm sorry that we have to close off with that, but I think it's a really important point. If the infrastructure for providing the service isn't there, then the service professionals can't serve. So how do you see that future developing?
So I think we as nonprofits can play a very important role. I think the mental health field needs to be more collaborative. We need to work together more. I think there are so many of us organizations, many of us who work on one disorder versus another disorder, that we as the sector have to play an important role. We can't just rely on funders and outside help. We as the mental health industry, we have to do a better job to do joint programming, to leverage resources, that the executive directors work together more, and that we don't view the pie as limited and view it as if we would collaborate more, the pie would be better and the people whom we would help would benefit. So I call upon all of us in the field to be more generous with our time, to work across sectors more, and not view the pie as limited.
And I think that it's a very important point, right? We're all becoming advocates for this idea of what mental health services are, for destigmatizing mental health. Christina, a very important point that you made, to create an equivalency between the mental health needs of people and the physical health needs of individuals. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, Dr. Christina Miller, President and CEO of the Mental Health America of Los Angeles, and Susan Gurley, Executive Director of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Thank your staffs, thank your volunteers, thank your board members, thank your funders. That's the nonprofit report. Everybody stay healthy, and attendees, as always, we really appreciate your participation. Have a great day.